Hi.
Good, how are you guys?
Good.
Hi, I'm Yasmin. Nice to meet you.
Very glad that you're here.
Oh,
I
thank you.
heard about the problems.
Yeah.
Dan, what's going on?
There's no power to this entire process. We're bringing up a projector.
Sorry, we call facilities to see if the breaker that's been
Yeah,
tripped,
that's what I was going to ask.
but it's locked.
I'm gonna just.
So we're waiting for them to show up. I'm so sorry. There's a work around it.
Monday morning.
Yeah, but that's
Well, this is unusual.
Often.
This room never gets used for teaching.
Oh, okay.
Otherwise, somebody would have discovered it and solved the problem for us.
Right, that goes with something you get to teach this always.
Oh,
Like,
really?
I have
She's
that-
good.
Yeah, I have the tech girls on speed diet.
Here, usually we don't have any issues.
No, this is unusual.
Yeah, this is super unusual. So basically, like, just the black current is turned off.
It's so far that's all that we can tell.
Is there a plug that we can, like, run somewhere else?
Well, so what they're going to do is they're going to bring up a separate other video projector card. Just not even worry about this because right now, that may have power. We have a hard. I think we have some difficulty accessing its controls.
This is here.
Yeah.
How's your trip?
Yes, it's okay.
Yeah.
This is sort of jet lag. Doesn't it? Yeah, try to say that to record in all.
Some convention she has some videos.
Yeah.
Some films and videos as well.
Yeah, that would be
Maybe
nice.
some light match or something.
Yeah, that would be nice. So, I just yes, yes. Yes, always.
Coming up with a media correct. Okay. Yeah. What about that? So we can put that on the. We'll connect it to the laptop too. Yeah. So it should be. Did you have your MacBook Pro? They just told me not to run it. It was on my way over. Other videos. Okay.
Apparently the shade doesn't work here.
So just the laptop on the other one?
I think the other one does. So we're going to be able to do that. It's false apart.
I'll just be gentle.
No, no. This is really it is. And the black house only didn't use that.
No, it's really interesting.
I think we should get all of this.
Yeah, it's good.
But it doesn't have
There's a lot of that.
yeah,
That's right. That's pretty good actually. And then how's the sound?
Oh, I'm not sure. So there are student classes that want to go and then they get out because of this classes, all the classes are integrated. So there's one.
So that entire unit has no power to it for some reason, and I'm not sure why. The other outlets are working around it, but just the one podium is no power to it. they're bringing out a roller projector, creating laptops, and we'll just put it in the aisle and project from there. I think they don't need multiple shots. Just sometimes she went down the face of the bear, so the whiteboard?
You guys okay? I put 2 new cartridges on your desk and I put a new plate on the door. Facilities have to accompany its terminator and they're going to come in and put the hook whenever they see the sticker. Because like it says, yeah, because sometimes they come overnight and they don't know where to hang it. But if you leave like a sticky note where to hang it, they'll just hang it for you. And I'll see you Wednesday. You know, I have to have that talk. Because I don't know. No, it's a good talk. I'm just trying to reimburse everyone. But I get a flood of receipts and I don't know who I paid out already. It's almost we got a deadline. The second week of May, I think, is our deadline to put in money. So I'm trying to get everybody's money today.
Yeah, basically, I think we don't know. It seems like we're getting. Yeah, we're getting a lot of students. In any case, their department is very big for some reason because of all these students. But it was full of students who are interested in doing something minor. That they're asking for different things.
Yeah, I just untangled this one. I didn't realize.
Because like some of those courses are too hard for them.
You know what, Dan? I think that's what we do is we should get rid of the chairs.
So I told them that I
There's no reason. This one, yeah, because people can't walk through. So then
Yeah, I
you just
think
walk
that's-
aside like that.
I read the policy and I've spoken to Nike and Eric about it. I feel they would want to change the mental class or the general type. So far, and they yelled at me, and they complained, but so far, so unless it's like some disability where they catch up the clients and stuff, yeah. But if it's too far, I'm sorry, it's the university. That's okay.
University.
How's it going? Mercury must be in the retrograde. No, it is. My office mate follows it really closely, so I know what's the politically correct term for my class? Like, yeah. So,
Let's do that. I think we need to do that. Mine is like very basic.
Research questions, like they have to have independent variable framed as research questions. Then I did surveys, and then I did narrative methods and coding as well, and I did NVivo, I think I taught them, or Atlas TI. And then Gephi. Have you ever used Gephi? Have you ever used Gephi? The data visualization? Where you can like import your data from Facebook, and then you can like do data visualization of like different like network connections. So it will show you like a group of friends from here, a group of friends from here, and how they're related and whatnot. So I used to do that with them. It's open source. It's called Gephi. I'll email it. It takes the only problem is if they have some restrictions with their computer, because I would like have them bring their computers to class, download the program, and but I did. So I'm glad to hear that somebody else is teaching some coding and some rigorous stuff.
You know, it's funny because when I go through it, or like, this is intense, like, what is this? Like,
Oh, you should have seen. I had them do standard deviation calculations on an exam by hand. By hand. Average grade was C in that one. Yeah.
Then I got there and
No.
Hey, Luca. Hi.
Yeah, but great to hear that.
A lot of people have come to us. Because like that was so much popular on my house.
Because you're speaking
I hear you. I was thinking of texting you over the weekend and reading all the different person. And then I texted some people and they were like, are you drunk? And I was like, I'm in this I don't understand
question?
because my wife has been
The point is, I'm just wondering if that works.
So she'll be sent home.
You don't want her back.
You do. And I love the French coat that you work with.
You get extra credit.
I sent it up. Luca gave me good language, so kind of forced people to
But I'm sorry, I messed up.
You want me to serve your food?
No, there is.
Okay.
It's not all.
That's something I can eat.
I think that's vegetarian, and I think the salad is vegetarian.
Plenty of food. And not only that, but I just discovered in Berlin this book from this capacity growth.
Hi, how are you? You know, even matching outfits.
We didn't plan it.
Paradise of back.
But it's like, you have spent so much time together now that you start, exactly. It's like humans and their dogs, they start to look like each other, or couples, you know. This is really happening to you now.
But then I realized that I got, you know, the Temporal called National Plan. And that's the reference.
Because, you know, it doesn't come with instructions.
Yeah.
That's right.
Like designs are kind of uniform.
have to take like a closer look because I should have breezed through it. I mean, breezed through it. It's a 400-page book. So I should have breezed through it. But, yeah, and supposedly he wrote it in less than 2 years.
It is pretty amazing. Was that paperwork chronology of mine in probably 6 weeks?
But that's it.
Paper was not a kind of live wire. It was just sort of ordinary plotting work. Like he didn't do anything until he was 30, and nobody thought he was going to make anything of himself.
But you have like self-esteem the size of the... Didn't he say, and now I am the last philosopher? He thought philosophy was this time kind of embedded in philosophy. It was where we are at the time. And I thought this was kind of to put them together in all 3 years' time. Interpret what had already been done. But he was wrong about that. He was wrong about art. He said that even more things about art. Art's kind of taken from philosophy. Anyway, but let's go on the last No coffee, huh?
the last
Hello, hi. How are you? I'm great. Hello. So good. Yeah. So good. Yeah, it was great. I'm exhausted, but it's so great. Yeah.
There you are.
They are faculty from the Civil Science department here, so I can pull they are fresh, newly hired to another room. Just like doing amazing things. They just created a social media at yeah, so Yasmin is from UC San Diego from communication. She was at the conference and she spent a couple more days in New York.
Talking about somebody who's
your hair
I think
Since we're like screaming, I'm not gonna tell you. Gonna cut this part out of But I just want to get home and I tell the people that I'm on the dialogue and it's not going to be on my door. So only if you're watching right now, you're just
So where does it say?
It works. Only works
Test 1, 2, test. While you're presenting, do you want to have a mic stand or so what I can get is a mic stand. How about a mic stand? You're going to do that? Okay, I'll be right back.
Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to get started, everyone. So thank you for coming. Welcome. My name is Macarena Gomez-Fariz, and I am the chairperson of Social Science and Cultural Studies here at Platt. I want to first thank we've had a lot of support for this initiative that we're starting and kicking off today. That's called the Gold Pratt Initiative, or inaugural lecture. This really kicks off our relationship with Goldsmiths and Pratt Institute, and it's very exciting. So I want to thank you, Dean Andy Barnes, for sponsoring and supporting this work. It's been a 2-year process to get to this point. We do have an agreement now with Goldsmith. Also, thank you, Donna Hyman, for coming and just being in the room with us today. So, yeah, we are excited to think of, it has been 2 years. I want to also thank Vicki Bell, who was the chair of the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths, and really developing this for us. Goldsmiths Sociology is a very good partner for social science and cultural studies. Here, we've had 5 or 6 students who have graduated from our department and have gone on to master's programs there. They're quite interested in bringing their students to our department here. We're beginning semester exchanges, and this really marks the beginning of the work, and it's an inaugural faculty lecture series. So today we're very excited to launch that exchange with Professor Yasmin Gunaratnam, and she represents for us the inaugural lecture. Yasmin is a reader in sociology at Goldsmith, University of London. She's had a number of publications that include researching race and ethnicity, methods, knowledge, and power, death and the migrant, the questions of the politics of immigration controversies. She's also edited a beautiful collection, 9 of them in fact, but one that I just saw called A Jar of Raw Flowers, Essays in Celebration of Dawn Berger. And she's a member of a number of editorial collectives for the Feminist Review and Media Diversified. So you see that we've had to kind of cobble together a system today, so I think it will work. But we'll hear from her today on questions of her research with migrants and refugees in English hospitals, in hospices, and in the community. And she really engages the work of Saidiya Hartman to pay attention to the, quote, terror of the mundane and the quotidian, rather than exploit the shocking spectacle, end quote. She'll bring some methodological examples to bear upon the question of expressive arts from her empirical research. She's been ongoing to describe the climates of hostility and their long drawn-out force, and she also attends to the complex sensual and organic residues of social injustice and violation, and how it can be carried out and lived in the body at the end of life. So we really look forward to hearing from you about those experiences. Join me in welcoming Yasmin for her lecture.
To be here and to represent my department, but you can be in touch with that maybe later. So what I'd like to do is to introduce some ideas from research I've been doing for quite a long time. So I've been working with dying migrants in the UK in hospices, hospitals and community for about 20 years. And this research has been ongoing, as well as academic research. My interest in narrative, I do lots of training with doctors, nurses and social workers. So I teach, some of you might know of it, narrative medicine. So I'm very interested, not just in theory, but in relation to the reason why I came to this research in the first place, which was to make and help contribute to better care at the end of life. So, what I'd like to do today is to offer some examples of a method that I've been developing, which I call empirical performance. It brings together my qualitative research on diasporic dying with the expressive arts. And a particular interest of mine is in narrative and storytelling. So first I'll do some contextualising for my research, and then just show you some examples of the empirical performance method. By way of theoretical framing, I'd like to start with an image from an installation called Visceral Canker. So this was created by the late British artist Donald Rodney, who died of sickle cell in 1998. Rodney lived and worked on materiality and semiotics of the black body to explore its intimacies and also its abstractions. Most often he would circle around themes of race, immigration, illness and gender. And in Visceral Canker, I had to get this from Creative Commons, they're not great images, but there's a crossing, pulsating crossing over of two biographies of pain and disease, the individual and the structural. This was first exhibited in 1990, and it was Rodney's reanimation of the heraldic shield of Sir John Hawkins, who was England's first slave trader. So if I could have the next slide. This is a close-up of the shield. So the shield, you can see, depicts 4 enslaved people there. And it was connected, you can see, by the tubes, but you can't see in this image, to another coat of arms of Elizabeth I. And you can see silicone tubes to your right of that image. And there was going to be a blood bag. So what Donald Rodney intended was an electrical pump which pumped his sickle cell blood across the shields, forging a queer kinship. There's a circulation here, a return, that Rodney puts into play as if his very life depended on it. In fact, what happened in this installation when he wanted to do the exhibit was a time of crisis in terms of moral panics around HIV and AIDS. So he wasn't allowed to use blood, his own blood. He had to use artificial blood for this installation. I want to start here because the installation animates questions that I've long been puzzling over in my research on transnational dying. What does it mean to think of social justice and biology together, and in the context of all sorts of scales of loss and violation? These concerns have been really animated more recently in the UK through what's been called the Windrush scandal. I don't know if people have heard of it here. And it was exposed by The Guardian at the beginning of January 2018. And these were some of the headlines. So the expose revealed that the government's aptly named hostile environment, that's what it calls its immigration policies, they were supposedly aimed at rooting out what the government called in inverted commas illegal migrants. But what The Guardian found out is that they've been playing out through a more clandestine and domesticated insecuritisation. And this was mainly along the lines of unmaking citizenship rights for post-war migrants, so people who'd come in the 1950s and 60s to Britain. So unlike the border as spectacle, where violence and death become image events, so this was very much covered in 2015-16, particularly with the large-scale migrations across the Mediterranean. This, what I'm really interested in, is this incremental, slow-moving depletion that that comes about when you live in climates of hostility. And it means that the effects of violence are very hard to discern and hold to account. I'm also interested in the fact that racism can be weaponised in this way, in terms of being mobilised into the climate. It's a perverse, unnerving kind of injury that social scientists have called social suffering and social pain. And that's what my most recent work has been examining. So how can we research social suffering? And there's political and methodological problems that go along with this. And partly it's because this suffering is so ordinary that we hardly notice its soft knife, and that was a very evocative phrase used by Arthur Kleinman, Vina Das and Margaret Locke. So it's a good point at this juncture to just clarify my terms. So social pain and suffering do have different sort of literatures and disciplines behind them. In palliative end-of-life care, there's a beautiful theorisation of pain, as Cicely Saunders, who set up the hospice movement, called it total pain. So she recognised pain as not being just physical, but also being social, spiritual and psychological. So I had a British Academy Fellowship in 2013, and I went back to Cicely Saunders' archive to see how she developed her ideas of social pain. And she was working, her early work was in the East End of London at St Joseph's Hospice, and she was working particularly with Jewish exiles and Irish people who were dying. And her theorisation of social pain really related to social isolation. She also thought that when people who were impoverished and were worrying, what's going to happen to my family, how will they manage when I die? She thought that economic worries were also constituted pain. And she saw this always coming under her view of medicine. So palliative care had to care about these sorts of issues. I'm just going to go to the bottom before I come to neuroscience. So social suffering, and I love this sort of really pithy definition from Arthur Kleinman and colleagues. The whole assemblage of human problems that result from what political, economic and institutional power does to people. So this is the idea that feminists and critical race scholars have been arguing for years. Social injustice hurts. The neuroscience, now wouldn't you know that neuroscientists are just running away now because they get loads of funding to do this. So they particularly talk about social pain, and they're looking at it in relation to social rejection and isolation. And of course they do really wizzy experiments. So could I have the next slide, please? So these are some of the experiments they do. They put you in an MRI scan, and they try and evoke different forms of pain, physical and social. So they operationalise social pain in different ways. So if I could have the next slide. So this is one of the experiments. So first of all, they put your thumb in a vice and see which part of your brain lights up. And then you're in an MRI scan and you're playing this simulated game of catch, and everything's going very nicely. There's 3 of you, and you're all playing very well with the ball. And then they change the experiment slightly. So if I could have the next slide. And this is how they operationalise ostracism. You're playing, and then suddenly 2 people start to exclude you, so they just throw the ball to each other. So can you guess what happens to your brain, which part lights up? So it's the same part of your brain that lights up for social pain as for physical pain. So what they are arguing is that social pain and physical pain share some of the same neurological substrates. So this is quite important. I'm not convinced exactly because they need to do some more research about the findings, but I think it's important to keep this in mind. So Cicely Saunders, when she developed her idea of total pain, it was an empirical ethnographic sort of theorisation. She was looking and responding to how people were dying. So one of the questions that comes up here is what forms of neurosubjectivity are being formed through these imaging practices and the visibilising of social pain. So with my cynical hat on, I've been thinking, might social pain one day be a factor in the calculus of migration? How much is a financial burden of social pain and suffering on health and social care, for example? One day might migrants and those claiming asylum be put into MRI scans to verify that they are actually suffering social pain and trauma. So this is some of the background, and let me give you a concrete example of some of these types of experiences of social pain and suffering in relation to migration and diasporic dying. Wait. So in terms of the challenge of researching pain, these are some of the problems we have. So it can be lacking a name. So for example, what is the name we have for living day in and day out with homophobia, for example, or racism? So if you don't have a language, a referent, it can be hard to verbalise your experiences or story them. There's a temporal issue, so I'm very interested in the chronopolitics of social pain and suffering. So it's not always accessible in the present. It can also be slow. It's mobile, so I've talked about it in relation to sort of quantum effects, that social pain can exist in 2 planes of time at once. And there can be what I call biopsychosocial tunnelling. So pain that happened in the past, particularly at the end of life, can come up. And I'm really interested in biology here. So when I was going through Cicely Saunders' archive, there were notes of people who'd been in concentration camps and work camps who, towards the end of life, were having hallucinations and traumas returning. This is also beautifully inscribed in novels, so I think novelists are doing a really good job about sort of documenting some of this. The experience and quality of suffering can change over time. Sorry, I'm timing myself. And it can also be passed on intergenerationally. A lot of the research on the intergenerational transmission of trauma has been done on Holocaust survivors. So again, I think this needs to be broadened out. So this is an image of Dexter Bristol. He came to the UK aged 8 in 1968 to join his mother from Grenada. He collapsed and died in the street from heart failure in March last year. His mother believed his death was caused by the extreme stress he'd been under for more than a year trying to secure his immigration status. So this was under the hostile environment policies. So lots of children who came over with parents from the Caribbean were on their passports. And the government, with its new legislation, was saying they were somehow not. So he came here when he was 8. There were people who came here unborn here, who are also now being asked to prove that they have the right to live here, and they have to prove the right for every single year they've lived in the country. So my brother is going through this at the moment. He didn't claim his citizenship rights, but we did. So Dexter Bristol, when the hostile environment policies were playing out, was sacked from his cleaning job in 2017 because he didn't have a valid passport. He wasn't able to claim the benefits he was entitled to because officials did not believe he was in the UK legally. Then his health started to deteriorate. He didn't go to the doctor, believing that he wasn't entitled to health care. And the coroner's request into his death in August last year refused to make the Home Office, that's the British government responsible for immigration, an interested party, as they call it, in the hearing. And they recorded a verdict of death by natural causes. And this is what his solicitor said. He was prepared to fight, but as the months went on and he was required to find more evidence, it became very difficult. And we saw him just decline into a shadow of himself. So being reduced to a shadow of himself is a really evocative imagery for the diffuse violence of imperial racism and its implication with contemporary border regimes, which is what I've been trying to sort of get at. So rather than political attention being focused only on border crossing or events of catastrophic death, I've also been really interested in studying and following the longer trails of border violence as they come up in hospitals and in homes and in the clinic. And this is to draw, when I mention the clinic, I'm drawing upon Fanon's biomedically reflective black analytic, and his concern with the phenomenological weight of colonialism and racism. And that's one thing he does so beautifully. Whiteness and colonialism appear as a weight on the black body. So, in Black Skin and White Masks was one of the earliest texts for me to connect and diagnose colonial racism as a toxic climate. For racialized others to live under colonialism was, to quote Fanon, to live in a constellation of deliria, frequently bordering on the region of the pathological. The use of the medical word delirium isn't accidental here, so it comes for me from Fanon's medical training. And it suggests how colonialism produces absences and ellipses that gorge out an unsettled presence in ways that can be both expressed as but also exceed psychological pathology, of which delirium is a symptom. So the biological and social are absolutely entangled in Fanon's analysis. And furthermore, by making this diagnosis, he instates a really important clinical and causal pathway: social injustice leading to bodily suffering. So he connects the work of life and politics to the clinic. So I'm really interested in here in adding pace and tempo to this, thinking about the pace of violence. And this is a growing concern in environmental humanities. And the term slow violence that I used earlier, I've taken from Rob Nixon's work on the dispersed effects of climate change and environmental disasters, such as toxic drift, deforestation and oil spills. And he describes these in very Fanonian terms as being driven inward, somatized into cellular dramas of mutation that remain largely unobserved, undiagnosed and untreated. So with this slow disbursement and distribution of violence across populations, Nixon sees this as also instigating a sort of a collective ignorance and forgetting of this type of violence. So for me, this has been turned recently to what I've been thinking of as the geologization of social thought, which has drawn out these long, sort of slow temporalities of violence. And this is where I come to some of the work by Christina Sharpe and actually other African-American scholars on the weathering hypothesis. And this was first put forward in the 1990s by Arlene Geronimus, who suggested that the early deterioration of the health of African-American people was the result of social exclusion. So weathering, more recently, has been used by Christina Sharpe in this really beautiful book, In the Wake of Blackness and Being. And this is what she says in relation to climates, really, particularly. She says, in what I'm calling the weather, anti-blackness is pervasive as climate. The weather necessitates changeability and improvisation. It's the atmospheric condition of time and place. It produces new ecologies. So my interest in weathering is how it might be used as part of a multi-scalar analysis that includes bringing together different genres and different forms of data, so empirical data, social cultural theory, poetry, arts, literary fiction, to acknowledge and trace the impact of the latter-day hostile environments, but also the ongoingness of imperialism and colonialism in the present. So working with debilitated migrants, I'm actually working with across different forms of debilitation, and the issues become more complicated. So I'm concerned with how disease and ageing, for some reason that's not working there, they're supposed to, could you just go back again and then just click it once? cancer. So these are some of the contexts I've been working in, where disease and ages, and very interesting in bio, can produce phenomenal multiplicities that can bring social suffering into appearance. So for example, when I was growing up, my parents came to England in the 1960s. My brother and I were getting terrible racism in school. My parents were sort of experiencing it in the workplace, but we never talked about it. And it was really interesting that at the end of life that these things can come up. And sometimes I wonder if neurochemistry and its changes. So it's very, the other area I'm interested in is queer dying. So if you think about identities that we've had to fight so long for an identity, but what happens, for example, in dementia when you start to forget? Might the clock be set back to normativity? So these are some of the issues that they can be but on the other side, I also think there might be a neurological buffeting from normativity, where inhibitions are lost. So people talk about things they've never talked about before, or they will express them in hallucinations. I'm particularly interested in diasporic dementia and some of the symptoms of wandering and what's called babble. So with end-of-life diseases or impairment, for example, they can be changes of sight, hearing, taste, muscle memory and comportment, kinesthetics and movement. And these can bleed into and tinker with cultural enzymes, and they unzip cultural hybridities. So one of the people I was interviewing, for example, he was a Muslim man, and when he was undergoing chemotherapy, his taste buds completely changed. So when he was admitted into the hospice, he chose the kosher diet because his usual diet was too spicy, but that was a sort of way of mediating the sort of faith-based prescriptions. Second, languages can be lost with certain forms of frontal or lobe dementia. For others, the spiciness and colours of once loved food can trigger nausea or changes to faith-based diet. Voice synthesizers flatten accents or impose vocal, ethnic and gender transitioning. The usual cultural indexes slip and slide. Stuart Hall once wrote about how since the colonised subject is positioned in relation to cultural narratives which have been profoundly expropriated, he or she is always somewhere else. At the end of life for me, changing biochemistry, neurology and hormones can thicken and sometimes materialise this somewhere else. So I want to just show you an example of empirical performance now. And this is an example that I called fields.
At times there are difficulties for us. Although she is here, in her mind she always thought she was back home. She's always talking about India. She'd wake up early in the morning and tell me, I'm going to the fields, and she would open the door and walk out, and that was really scary for us. It happened a number of times that she had opened the door and walked out and got lost. On a few occasions we had to involve the police to find her. She'd walked about 2 miles away from home. Then I went away on holiday, and my brother took the decision to put her into a care home because his family would find it difficult to look after her. He didn't ask me what I thought or what I wanted to do. My mother is a very religious person. Without fail, she would go to the temple, do her daily puja. Even today, although she's not aware of what she's doing with her hands, without the mark in her hands, her fingers, her hands are still working as if she's praying. And the other thing is, My mother was very strict about food. Food was not allowed from outside, not even bread. Now she doesn't even know what she's fed on. She doesn't even know what she's eating. She eats whatever is given to her in the home. She finds it hard to express herself, and without the language, she's totally in her own world, totally shut down. Day by day, she's becoming weaker.
There are a bunch of things going on in that small narrative, but there's a couple of things that I want to focus on for the sake of time. And these are non-cognitive circuits of touch and also presence-absence dynamics. So Field is a story of loss, and it's told across the changing tides of dimension relationships. It's a rumination on the rearranging of thought, memory, and faith that diasporic dimension brings up. And with these losses in mind, I want to just think about the mala beads. So in that short clip, Harshini, as I called her, talks about her mother. The mala beads aren't there, but her fingers are still working these invisible beads as if they were there. So we might think about what our relationship is then into objects, and objects not just as us giving them thought, but as perhaps in how objects act upon us. And I'm also interested in her wandering. So she wanders out of her house in an urban area, saying she's going to fields in her village that she left decades earlier. So she had gone from India to Uganda and then was expelled from Uganda, and their family came over as refugees to England in the 1970s. So these technologies, how might we think about even beads as a technology of the self? And what's interesting for me is the bodily switch points, and that's a term I take from Saidiya Hartman's work on debility, and how they're conjured in the story, and something about the excessiveness of objects. So the fingers actually don't need the object to pray. They're kind of outdone the thingness of the beads. Let's have the next slide. And it's really made me think of what Noz has dubbed the Brown Commons. And this is how he described it. The Brown Commons is not about the production of the individual, but instead about movement, a flow, and an impulse, to move beyond the singular and individualised subjectivities. It's about the swerve of matter, organic and otherwise, the moment of contact, the encounter and all that it can generate. The contours of the Brown Commons, for me, are all the more striking in the happening of diasporic dementia. So there's this sort of narrative about the end of life, which is about loss, but also bodies are incredibly creative, right up until the moment of death. The performed story of the mala beads, for me, is brown in the sense that the words, gestures and movements point to this swerve of matter into a bigger, stranger imaginary of sense-making. The habitual rhythms of demented fingers continue the more collectivised tactile movements of prayer as devotion. And as the fingers move repeatedly across the phantom beads in a tactile refrain, they are caught up in, but also adventure away from the obdurate thingness of the beads. There are also the specific time-space confusions of diasporic dementia, through which Nirmala travels across simultaneous but non-contiguous space and time. So this is really interesting about the creativity of diasporic dementia, and what it also tells us about the limitations of how we think about linear time and space. So my hope with Phil, so I use this film a lot with teaching and training, and also the Deaf Cafe movement in the UK has picked it up as a way of trying, so that the palliative care movement and the deaf movement is very white and very middle class. And so they've been using this film to sort of generate discussions about diasporic dying, which for me is the predicament of our time. You know, some of you might have already have experienced this. So what my hope in the field was to put into appearance, but also into question, the imminence of the creative deterritorializations of diasporic demented dying. So I'm talking about another form of migration here, that the body stays in place, but it can summon different lands and people to it. My territories are out of grass, Deleuze and Guattari assert in 1,000 Plateaus, not because they are imaginary, but the opposite, because I am in the process of drawing them. There's another side to the symptom of wandering I've had to consider in writing this empirical performance, and that's whether, so Nirmala didn't speak very good English, she was very marginalised, but when her mind travels to India, might this be a refuge from ground social suffering? And here's the sort of the difficulty, because could the wandering be driven in part by ground social suffering, or am I over-reading race into this diasporic story? So that's one of the things that I'm still sort of puzzling. I think art does this effectively much more in terms of what John Keats called negative capability, being able to hold doubt and mystery. So when migration researchers and activists begin to attend to the internet animations, so debility and disability are just woefully under-theorised really in migration and just generally in social theory. There's a real inadequacy of language to narrative. And because weathering can press in on bodies unseen, and because disability can rearrange subjectivity, analysis has to involve some speculation. So Luciana Parisi, who's a cultural studies scholar, describes the feature of the speculative method, and this is to quote from her: it demands of thought to become felt, fact to become potential, imagination to supersede observation, object to affect method, method to become transformative of the object. So this is the whole discussion methodologically of methods being invented in the sense that they change what you're studying, act back on. So one way in which I've tried to incorporate work speculation more broadly is to turn to the arts and research. So I'm trying to do less and less academic writing. And I found the arts are much more hospitable to the sort of notions of weathering than social analysis can be. So what I'd like to do is just to sort of think more about the types of stories that I've been working in. So there's some really spectacular events when people are very articulate about how racism has impacted their lives. And those are the ones, firstly, that I'm drawn to because they're so clear. And after this sort of period of time, I've been going back to what was sort of tiny details, really. So, in choosing to document and story certain lives and death in the performances, I've been mindful of the scalar approach of Saidiya Hartman's exploration of transatlantic slavery. So she says, rather than trying to convey the routinized violence of slavery and its aftermath through invocations of the shocking and terrible, I've chosen to look elsewhere and consider these scenes in which terror can hardly be discerned. But there's an issue with this, that some scepticism is required to accept the lines that Hartman draws between the quotidian and the spectacular. And this is what Fred Moten actually believes. So what concerns Fred Moten is how the invoking of the traumatic event can serve, to quote, to preserve the appeal to the very idea of redress. So with the spectacular, with the scene, with the trauma, there is also this hope of redress, which he says has been shown to be impossible. So what he's completely alert to is to quote, an irredeemable and incalculable suffering from which there is no decoupling, since it has no boundary and can be individuated and possessed, neither in time nor in space, whose commonplace formulations it therefore obliterates. So you can't, one of the things about social suffering is you can't necessarily locate it or tie it to an event, if this causing that. So if you can't tie it to an event, you can't locate it, you can't have redress, what is the work of politics and activism then? So I want to just finish with one last example of an empirical performance. And this is a poem called Dust to Dust, which comes from an interview that I did with a Jamaican-born builder called Morris, who was a Windrush era migrant. And he'd come to England with the intention of always going back to Jamaica, and it never quite happened. I interviewed him in this really tall, high-rise apartment. It was a tiny flat where he lived with his 2 daughters and his wife. And he was dying from lung cancer that he suspected had been caused in his life as a builder when he'd been exposed to asbestos. So to speculate about debilitation and weathering in such circumstances, about what it might mean to have lived a life in a toxic environment, to feel not able to breathe as you approach death, to yearn to be somewhere else, is to begin to try to piece together a reference for weathering out of the real, the barely there, and what is imagined. So I'll just stop there.
Arrived on Saturday night. Black and Liverpool, Victoria train, the dressing notion, grip tight. Sunday morning, looking out the window, I took her. Honest. Brick houses. Smoke through the chimney like West Indies boiling house where the new go round running king. Smoke coming out. I said, this house like boiling house. Maybe let it pass through. All week long. Always dressing suit and tired to go to build inside when you turn the sun out. That's how I come to touch this sickness. Old buildings, plasterboard and asbestos, and concrete plenty, tearing down the ceilings, inhaling, choking, coughing up dust, spit, thick, black like gold. 4 years I had this cup. 4 years. Down to overflow. I buy different bush, boil it, roast them on top of the fire, squeeze it out with honey, like at home. Then the doctor showed me x-ray, shadow over the lung. I think it was a smile. I grew up with good parents, believe in God. I trust and pray and things like that. Not planning to die over here. Not me. Not if I. I want to go home. We're in our land, we're happy. A spirit free to fly like a bird over the mango tree, apple tree, rivers and the sea. When the moon shines at night, 7 times a year, can stand and look for miles and miles.
Okay, so just lastly, some of the stories that I've been working with are really related to how we might develop feminist sense organs to pick up and be attentive to these sorts of experiences. And should we move forward if not? No? Okay. But some of the case stories I've developed in this site, which came out of that British Academy project. So there's, and again, it's mainly based on care professionals, but there's audio stories, there's film stories and exercises that you can use to sort of discuss some of these things. So I'll stop there because I think it's exactly time. So thank you.
We have some time to engage on this. I think this will resonate with, I know, many of the work of people here, and there's so many intersections, so please keep your questions and comments forward. Thank you.
I wanted to say something more about your first instance, Rodney's work and the first images you showed us from this exhibition. You know, just clarify the connections between that and the other directions you're following up in this talk.
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in Rodney's work because he was one of the first black artists in the UK who was consciously putting his disability into his art. So with his sickle cell, he had to be hospitalised several times. So his installations included things like X-rays. There's a beautiful installation called The House of My Father, which he built from his own skin that had been taken from an operation. So I was really, particularly with visceral cancer, I was enthralled by the way he was wanting to also link his position in the UK to slavery too. And so that crossing over, you know, his blood was going to be pumped to connect these two heraldic shields. John Hawkins, the first British slave trader, and Queen Elizabeth, who was, you know, steeped in the slave trade. And I was interested in sort of these silicone tubes pumping his blood through them. So that's, you know, the forging of the kinship there, but particularly in relation to two levels of analysis. So that imbrication of the personal and the structural. And in relation to my work on diasporic dying, I think what I've been really interested in is how it symbolises the meeting point of two thresholds. So the movement from life to death and the movement across territories. And I think Rodney's work, he has a beautiful collection called Double Think, which you can get from Autograph, which was an association of black photographers, which was set up by Stuart Hall. So you can see his work there. It's also in the Tate. So any other, not necessarily a question, but maybe a resonance or a...
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. I think it made me think about so many different kinds of things. And one thing is around temporality and time sense. And just yesterday I was talking to a taxi driver who was saying how from Morocco, the last thing that he wanted was to be buried here. And just how he described the violence of dying. That would be the worst kind of death, is to die in the United States. And one of the things he also talked about was premature death in relationship. He had said that there were a number of, in his immigrant community, that what he'd seen is once people actually got to retire after a very long, hard life, they died very soon after that. So to work until 65 or to work until 68, and then just to stop and die. And he really was lamenting upon that. So if you could just comment, I mean, that's just one anecdote, and you have such rich case stories, but if you could talk about kind of that sense of time and that's present here, but also the kind of premature death that's so much part of the literature.
Yes, it's really interesting in relation to, I just talk about the end of life wishes. Mm-hmm. So I've been really interested in where people say they want to be buried and to die. And so the rituals, so for certain communities you have to go back to your homeland and be buried there. So my parents, for example, took their ashes back to Sri Lanka and they're buried there. But it's also changing now, and I'm really interested in the inventiveness of diasporic rituals. You know, so one man I interviewed, he was really aware of how onerous it was for Hindus to, you know, for their ashes to go back to India and be sprinkled in the Ganges, and how much it cost. And so he said he was saying, I've asked my father to sprinkle my ashes in the park where I go to for a walk every day. It's a local park in South London. And so he was sort of thinking about, and he said that's where I feel at peace. His father was very old, he didn't want him to make the journey. So I think people are kind of adapting. But I've done some work on end-of-life stories, and also whether them not wanting to be buried here also says something about not feeling at home here. And so I had a nurse who I interviewed who was talking to me about another person from the Caribbean, and she said to her, I don't want to be buried here because the ground's cold. You know, and she said, when I go back home, you know, I'll have my friends and family and there'll be sun. And it was really, again, the weather, you know, the metaphor of the weather was really interesting, that how people talk about where you'd want to be laid to rest is really interesting in relation to social suffering. And then about premature death. So both my parents died when they were 62. So this is this is a huge reason why I came into this field as well. So both just shortly after they worked themselves into the ground and then died. And so I think there has to be a public health approach to transnational dying in a way to sort of connect all of these things. So there's higher rates of, so people from black and minority ethnic communities, for example, present later still now in the UK with sort of terminal conditions which makes them less curable. So cancer, for example. So I think we have to sort of think about bringing together which is what I think the early work on the weathering did, to say, look, let's look at premature death, and that is a type of weathering. And Christina Sharpe sort of taken it, the weather in different ways. But I do think the whole notion, I'm really interested in the sort of the biosocial in relation to colonialism, racism, and the toll it takes on bodies.
So thank you very much for a beautiful talk. I think it's a very engaging and interesting and worthy topic that you are approaching here, and I think that you did justice approaching it from multiple vantage points. And I wanted to ask a question with regards to the aspect that deals with the narrative of dying in a diasporic land. And have you thought about or have you engaged in any analysis of a group that may have gone back to actually die in their native countries? And what I'm specifically interested in is perhaps the complicated action at a point when this bucolic landscape that they've constructed in the diaspora meets the reality of the native land, which has subsequently changed.
Yes, no, I haven't. There are some studies, particularly in the Netherlands, I think, who followed Turkish migrants back to die. I haven't. I mean, there is a big disconnect. So one of the empirical performances I did, I interviewed a man from Ghana who was in his 40s, and they were so poor. And his son was 18 months old at the time when he was dying, and he was really interested in how what his end of life wish was. Because he said to me, and the word he used was, I'm frightened that if my son sort of carries on in the UK, he's going to melt away into nothingness. You know, his Ghanaianness isn't going to be there. And so he said, that's why I want my body to be buried in Ghana. And it was sort of like a morbid umbilicus. You know, that his son would have a reason to go back there to see his father and then connect with the culture and it's also a very gendered narrative, because he did have a partner who was also from Ghana, but there's this sort of heritage being passed down the male line. And so, I mean, I was really moved by his story anyway, because his son was just 18 months old, and then a few years later I had my own son, and then this is really interesting about biography, that you suddenly go back to stories and they turn like a diamond, you see a different facet. And this bothered me for so long about thinking about this, but I also followed the family, and they just didn't have enough money to take his body back to Ghana. It's really expensive, so it's about £3,000 if you want to take a body back. It's cheaper if you take ashes back. For somebody who's very ill who goes back to die, you have to have somebody with medical training who accompanies the person. So it can be £10,000 to go back to die. So I think just in terms of financially, it's ruinous. And people are also, when they have a terminal diagnosis, are often thinking about what's the impact. So I haven't done any research with people going back, but I think it is also a reality. In the empirical performance that I didn't show you, I tell it through soccer. So I imagine Ibrahim's son, so the person I was talking about, he would be the sort of, just a couple of years older than my son. There's a lot of swearing in South East London vernacular in there. But he talks about going back to Ghana, that they saved up enough money and they go back and it's just skinny money all the time, because there is a business there, and then that trying to evoke that shift that you're trying to do what your parents thought, but the reality is, death is commercialised. So, yeah, it's a really good question. Yes.
I just went to the Netherlands and stayed in a little town called Wees, and which we were excited to hear was the town where the dementia village is.
Oh yes, I've seen that.
Yeah, and I wondered what you thought about that model, if it's useful elsewhere, if it. I don't know much more about the model. I wonder if talk a little bit about that in relation to the social pain, isolation.
Yeah, I've only seen little clips of that village, and it always strikes. So this is a village that they built in the Netherlands. It's completely for people with dementia. So you can go shopping, for example, in the supermarket, and if you don't pay, that's fine. No one's going to rush after you. And so it's the idea that you can carry on living an independent life much longer in a dementia-friendly environment. One of the things that did worry me when I saw it was it's very white.
Yeah.
So that, and that is very interesting, because one of the things about people caring for their families, and people of colour caring for their families, is often because they're really worried about the care in institutions, as well. So the other thing with dementia that's very interesting, and also the end of life, is that there's been lots of stories of people who say their father or their mother's never been racist, and then with dementia, so I'm really interested in this racial unconscious. And so care workers who come in have been racially abused by dementia patients who their families are saying they've never been racist. So, does the great cultural unconscious sort of surge up in relation to dementia? Yes?
No, I just really quickly. You said something about the queer death. You were talking about queer death. Could you say more about that?
Yes. Well, this is sort of, because this has to be documented, so I'm hoping that there'll be more research on this. But particularly with dementia, there's been a couple of anecdotal cases of people forgetting that they're queer as they get older. And so, this is very difficult from the stories I've read, because people also forget, that you're my daughter or that you're my sister. So, but that's kind of different. So they're forgetting who people are, but also I wonder about sort of heteronormativity sort of creeping back in. So if you're starting to forget your identity, might your queerness be part of that? And this is just some worries that people have been writing about in relation to, so Ruth Fletcher, for example, has done some research on older lesbians and gay people who are dying, and their stories are just full of fears of this, of forgetting that they're queer, but also being in a home where it's so heteronormative that they won't be able to be out as well. So there isn't any empirical research on this, but I think there will be in the future. There's stories that have been told about it.
Thank you.
Lots of times in relation to that.
Thank you so much. That was so lovely. I'm particularly taken by this concept of empirical performance. My question isn't about that, but I just wanted to mention that I love that idea. I'm wondering if you have case stories or comments about you mentioned multiple migrations, and one of these migrations is, as you're dying, or I'm wondering if you have case stories or comments about migrations for refugees and immigrants where the country no longer exists, right? And so I was born in South Vietnam, a country that no longer exists. and South Vietnamese people don't recognize the government. I'm sure you know this. That's currently there, don't recognize the country that's currently Vietnam. So I'm wondering about, again, just maybe some thoughts that you might have about what does migration look like when the territory is physically there, obviously, but is not your home, right? So where do these migrants, what kind of migration stories or trajectory is available or is happening for people who are stateless in different ways?
It's a really, really good question. I don't have an answer, so I don't know. I haven't personally been working on it, but I think that's really interesting in relation to the matter of sort of deterritorializations, but also sort of existential homelessness. So for refugees, we know that flight is not just an objective reality; it's a subjective reality. So I think this would be a really important question in relation to future research. There's been some research done on refugees in camps. I was talking to a doctor last year who was trying to develop a research project, and he was talking about how people sort of snuck back at night to, just over to sort of drop ashes on the other side of where a border was. But it's such an important question, so maybe it's a project that you could, I don't know.
It's fascinating. I just want to add one more thing. I was recently in Vietnam and met with a group of, in the United States, who are identified as Vietnamese refugees who have been deported recently through the Trump administration. But they're actually ethnic minorities in Vietnam. They're indigenous to Vietnam, right? And so the Vietnamese government, it's a whole, so they're stateless, but in the United States, deported them back to supposedly their home country, which is not their home, So there's just all these different kinds of, I don't know what kinds of migrations those are called.
Yes, exactly.
But it's this migration of people who have, they don't belong anywhere in some way.
Yeah.
Or even within any political category, right?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. That's exactly it. That I was talking about terminology, and sometimes there isn't even the terms for this. And it's interesting the recent Windrush deportations. So some people are being. There was one person who came when he was 7 months old, and they're trying to deport him back to Jamaica. He's never ever been there. So these things are sort of happening now. And what you're talking about is also another sort of complication of this. Thank you for that. That's really
it's beautiful, just absolutely beautiful paper, and it's so intimate. I started a little essay when I was dealing with my parents at my father passing in India. I called it Diasporic Dying. But I was searching for a language because there is no writing on the affect and process of diasporic dying, and I was searching for a language, and so I'm listening to how you're thinking of the neurological implications of migration and dying. Do you find certain kinds of techniques of writing, techniques of praxis that have been kind of effective or interesting in coming to this process? And I was also very surprised with how detailed you are our patients, because in bracket everything's so capitalized. There's so much legal, there's so much legal, what should I say, protections around patient information. You have access, I'm curious about the access you have. So well.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with the last point about access, because I didn't really say much about my research. So this is sort of what I presented here is from 3 different studies, but the first study was an ethnography of St Christopher's Hospice in South London, which was the first hospice that started off the modern hospice movement. It was set up by Cicely Saunders, who I spoke about earlier. She's fascinating. She's very posh. She started off as a social worker at Oxford. She started off studying PPE, politics, philosophy, economics, which is at Oxford is what most of the cabinet did. It's very elite. She was there during the war, and she thought, I'm really privileged, I can't be doing this. She went down to London and trained as a nurse to help. She hurt her back and then retrained as a social worker to still work with dying people. And she was noticing this pain, and somebody said to her, nobody's going to take you seriously unless you're a doctor, if you want to really do something about the pain of dying people. So she retrained as a doctor at the age of 40. So this is years ago, and in her ideas of total pain, you see the philosopher, you see the nurse, and she was also brilliant in developing sort of pain control, so mixing opioids, for example, and really taking people's pain seriously. So I did my ethnography there because they came to look after my mum. She died at home. I'd never even heard of a hospice before. And the nurses came in. My mother was a nurse, so she knew exactly what was happening, which is kind of difficult in a way. But she died without pain at home. And that's where I became really interested in this. So I then did my PhD a few years later, and so my ethnography, I worked in the hospice as a volunteer. They had a day centre. So I worked there, and I was just in an apron, bringing people tea and coffee, but I got to know people. I did interviews with people who were dying, and that had to all go through ethics. I spent a month writing my ethics proposal to get it through, because when you say you're doing research with dying people, all the sort of red lights go up. And I also I did an observation, so I was with a home care nurse, lots of conversations in cars by the curb, just watching them also deliver care. And so I didn't kind of quite realise that would probably be impossible, would it, that sort of research here? But so that's how I've got these stories, and then later on I've also been doing work with listening to both dying people and people who are looking after them, family carers and such like. So in terms of access, that's basically what I've been doing. These have all passed through the sort of ethics board. And what was the technique of writing you were saying? I don't know. So if any of you do come across things on diasporic dying, novels or poetry, send them to me. I have a big file where I collect from things in the Huffington Post to Paul Hairs, who wrote this lovely quote. He said, "I don't want to die in another language." And so I have a sort of folder where I collect all of these things, but there are more stories. So there's a Rome Turn has a novel called Brixton Beach, which is very uncannily near my own story. It's about a Sri Lankan family, mixed race, Tamil and Sinhalese, and they had to migrate to the UK, and then the mother has dementia, and when she has dementia, she starts reliving everything that happened to her in Sri Lanka. Diaz as well has some stuff in his work around diasporic dying. But so if you have ever come across anything, email me. But I do think that it's going to be coming up in novels more often and more beautifully sort of evoked, really.
Yes, hi. So by the way, I am from Sri Lanka. My dad's Italian, my mom's Sinhalese.
Oh my goodness.
But the question I have for you, actually, thank you again for your amazing talk, and so deep and reflective. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts, because you talked about Dexter Bristol and how he collapsed and died of a heart attack. I'm interviewing Muslims in Vermont, and in addition to various other immigrant groups as well, and newcomers to the state of Vermont. And I've discovered recently that some of the Muslims there have been enduring a lot of racism especially since 9/11. And I noticed that some of the women that I interviewed, which I actually put out at a mosque, it turns out that some of the newer immigrants who have been here in the US for 2 years or in Vermont for 2 years, had had only positive things to say, and the people who had been here, the women who had been here longer, had a lot of stories to say about racism and how it impacted them as well. It's visceral, and it creates a lot of negativity, and brings everything back up. So I've discovered in Vermont there is no system of dealing with hate crimes. And so none of these things are getting reported as hate crimes. And Vermont is in the process of figuring out how to deal with all of these reports and issues and incidents. But I was just wondering if you had anything about how this trauma manifests over the long term and, thoughts.
Yeah, I don't really in terms of sort of hard empirical data, but one thing I do know is that hospices and hospitals are archives of these sorts of experiences. So I think nurses, doctors, social workers are really hearing these testimonies of how living with racism, and when you're going through an acute illness, it can bring up other experiences as well. So I was very interested. I use this very peculiar, very complicated German method called biographic narrative interview method. And it just starts off with an open question, which is, I narrowed it down, so tell me about your experiences of illness and health. And I was really interested, so many people started off from points of migration, so you ask them about their life, really. And when people are dying for, first generation migrants, they're often looking back over their whole lives. So one of, several, but one of the women I interviewed saying, I've never talked about these experiences, I haven't even talked about them with my children. So I think, and they do, in hospices, they do creative writing and work, and I've seen sort of migrant stories, including these experiences that come up, and those stories will probably go to families or whatever, but they're not archived in any sense. So I think there's probably lots of anecdotal information and narrative, but nobody's really systematically sort of collating those. And when you're living in a context where it isn't recognised as well, years later, I think that's going to have an impact on how people make sense of that experience. So, thank you.
Yeah, correct me if I was overreading you, but at a certain point you seem to be proposing diasporic dying as something that not just the diasporic people do, but a kind of dominant model of dying at the present time. And it made me think that, in this country in particular, social isolation, we believe here is a right that belongs to all old people, and regardless of race or color. And so in that sense, it is something that tends to die in a, say, neoliberal phase of capitalism. Is that right? Was I hearing that right? That there's something, like exemplary, if you want to use that word, about diasporic dying in your view, even if one is not dying in another language as such.
I mean, I wasn't meaning it in that way,
Okay.
but I can see what you mean. What I was particularly referring to is I think there's been this point of time that we're living at is just marked by migration in a way that previous times haven't. So I think diasporic dying in that way is going to be a predicament that will touch us all, regardless, just through friends, neighbours, as well as family, that we'll all come across stories and experiences like that in a few years to come. But do you want to say more about what you were thinking, what it sparked?
Well, yeah, no, I come from diasporic people myself, and
yes.
my family is Chinese and British, and belong to a diasporic lineage of their family, so they moved across the world without a nostalgic or kind of melancholy relationship to the homeland. So it's slightly different than I think many of the examples you gave. It's with the expectation of profoundly isolating and alienating experience that is the farthest from the experience that most people want, and that it is a dominant experience. So, I mean, it just seems like there's so many threads of what you're talking about that reach through and beyond diasporic people which the resonances of the work.
Sorry, just a quick question. Thank you for an amazing talk. There's so much in this field. We're just all just taking it in. Is there a relationship from the perspective of dementia, especially from these case stories that you've shared, between the wandering or the types of time slippage that happens and perhaps the stories that people grow up telling, or the mythologies, right? Because it's a certain kind of time, a time slippage that some stories allow, like with mothers might tell their children about a homeland, that mothers or fathers or caretakers or whatever they may tell about mythological characters. I'm recalling one image of a person lying down with like an omelet seatbelt on top, and like all this stuff. So there's a certain kind of movement in time that's permissible anyways, right, in storytelling. So is there any way you can talk through, are there differences? Is this something that all dementia patients are capable of doing? Or do they wander differently?
I don't know, because dementia is also a very generic term, so there's different forms of dementia. And so I really don't know the answer, but that's such a good question about wandering and the sort of relation also to a narrative context, is what you're saying.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know, but I do know that is something I will think about. So thank you.
Thank you. Is that okay? Just one last question and then we'll wrap up. Sorry.
Yeah, also just want to express my appreciation for your talk. It was so beautiful and so layered and both, like really embodied and theoretical all at once. So thank you. I was really interested in the way in which you're thinking about questions of representation and kind of witnessing of this kind of structural, slower weathering, right? Violence and then death. It's like different kinds of temporalities, and the ways in which I'm really curious about this idea of the empirical performance as well. I actually wasn't totally clear if that was actually the interview of someone. It was someone who was then performing an interview, right? So it's just, that was really interesting to me to kind of think about, the way in which you're engaging with creative form, creative praxis as a way of witnessing and holding both the kind of, I think of it as like the global intimate, the kind of structural, right? So I just love to hear you talk about that, or your thoughts about that.
So witnessing, I think, is really, really important to me. So when I started, this research has completely changed me. So life, when I started doing my PhD, life became a very serious business. And so I'm always sort of thinking about, and I go back to stories as well over years. So there's a slow research, I'm a real advocate of slow research. So now with funding, you get 3 years, do your analysis, move on, next. And so what I've been doing is just to go back again, and also in terms of research, we have this idea that you kind of have an analysis and that's it. And sometimes I do go back and think, no, that didn't get that right, or something happens, you listen to something on the radio, or something happens in your life, and you see something differently. So this idea of testimony and witnessing, I just take really seriously, because I think people gave me their stories. So people were telling me things probably because I wasn't in their family that they felt they could talk about. Often it's quite good to have somebody who has no connection with you in that way. And with things like, I just remember interviewing someone from the Philippines, and she was really worried about her daughter who's 16 who might not be able to cook chicken curry in the way, you know, just even the really practical things like that, I think is really important that you sort of witness those small worries as well as the sort of bigger ones. And so with the case stories, they are really sort of trying to do justice to the stories that I've been given. And because I also use them with care practitioners, it was really interesting. So I did a session with palliative care practitioners in Belgium, and one of the clinical psychologists in question said to me, those films, they're love letters to your participants, aren't they? And yeah, it just, that really struck me as, again, somebody, you know, when you're really working close and things, you don't necessarily see them. But these are sort of fragile missives, really, ways of commemorating lives that, and it's very, you know, the hospice is based in a very working class area in South London, and these stories are so rich. So there's definitely that. To say thank you for that question about the empirical performance, because I said nothing about it really. So I'm working with actors, so these are all dramatisations. So I work with them, and it's really interesting because the actors bring their own inflections and their own histories and their own memories. So in Dust to Dust, that actor, his father was dying. He kept breaking down in the recording, which is why we filmed it slightly differently. And you'll see he's kind of reading some of it. And so there, I think there's a sort of co-working that happens. People bring gestures to something, and I sort of look at it or an inflection or a tone, and I just see it and hear it differently. Yeah, I'm very interested in also this performance of working with actors who might be experiencing that situation as well. But yeah, they're all dramatised.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all. We've got some questions. I've written them all down, so I'm possibly over them. Thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you so much.
Very interesting.
Then you look at the face of the presenter, like smiling and stuff. Yeah.